Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are on this fast-forward planet, which is immersed in turbulence of all kinds: geopolitical, climatic, social, information. Turbulence is probably the biggest of all. And that's why I'm really glad today to have HANNAH RITCHIE come on the show for what I call a data-driven She's a data-driven sustainability guide in a belief-driven world. And that's a problem for any of us who are trying to foster progress using data, or as journalists do, trying to get to the realities or amid all the perceptions and conflicting arguments. HANNAH is the lead researcher, lead scientist at Our World in Data, which is, it was quite a number of years ago when I started watching that web effort grow. And it's just been a fantastic force for rational thought and hopefully for action. And HANNAH has slipped in some time to be on Sustain What today to talk to you all about her learning curve and the content of the book a little bit, but I want to focus more on the bigger picture. What do we do with this information too? So HANNAH, it's just great finally to meet you, and congratulations with everything that's been underway so far.
No, thanks for having me on. And I'm a big fan of the podcast, and I've watched a lot of previous episodes and learned a ton as well. So yeah, looking forward to the conversation.
Well, that's great. I want to start with just a little bit about your journey and your current work before the book came about. You're at, as I said, Our World in Data, which is based at Oxford. And Max Roser, I'm not sure how it got formed there. I wanted to get Max on years ago, but we never quite found the time. So could you just give a little quick sketch of what this is, why it formed at Oxford, why it's not more like a Wikipedia? It's kind of like a Wikipedia, but with a very much of a focus on these issues that we care about for sure. How did it come about, from your understanding?
Yeah, so it was founded by Max Roser, and his background is as a researcher. He was doing a postdoc at Oxford at the time, and his research area was global poverty and inequality. So he's an economist, and I think kind of where it started to stem from was this realization that this disconnect between what he perceived many of the big global trends to be doing and what they were actually doing. And often, even despite, being an economist and working for years in global poverty and inequality, like even by the end of university, like many of these trends, he thought they were going in the opposite direction, and they've been going in the other direction.
Right.
So I think part of that drive stemmed from this understanding that you can only really understand the world by stepping back and looking at the data. And just this, no one was really having these conversations, or at least these conversations were not as widely had as he wanted. So he started, building this website in the background, like the beginnings of Our Own Data. And really the concept of Our Own Data is what we look at as what we frame as the world's largest problems. And that's not just environmental problems, although we cover that a lot, but also health, poverty, inequality, war, like all of these like massive problems that the world faces. And what we try to do is to bring to the fore the data and research we think we need, or the world needs, to understand these problems and start to work towards solutions. So I think we kind of
you must feel like you're in overload mode completely 24/7. And I saw that picture shows, I don't know, 7 or so people. How many people are involved?
It's grown a lot over the last few years. So when I joined, there was 4, and for a long time there was just 4 or 5. Actually, by the time COVID hit, there was only 5 of us, and then we started undertaking trying to gather and present the global data on COVID. And over the last few years, we've grown a lot. So now we're around 25. And that's a mix of researchers, data analysts, and also like web developers. I think that's like kind of key to Our Own Data, is that we have this kind of interdisciplinary mix, where kind of the amazing graphical tools that the web developers build allow the work of the researchers and data analysts to come to life. So I think we're quite unique that we have this like nice interdisciplinary team. But yeah, we've grown a lot kind of post-COVID.
Yeah, well, it's that's good then. It's good that the resources are there. We'll talk about that more in a minute. And one of the pictures, I have a couple of graphs here that kind of illustrate um, one point that you make right at the beginning of the book, which is that the work of Hans Rosling and Rosser and others has revealed that human circumstances have largely been improving, but environmental issues, species loss and the like, are diverting in different ways. And that's sort of where you come in and where the book kind of zooms in. I think it's important to make that point too. Um, so you have the book, and you now also are on Substack, like I am, which is great. I see you've generated or gained a lot of following there. It's fantastic. And I'm sure we could talk forever about how you fit this all into your workday, but I want to be sure people understand. It's called sustainabilitybynumbers.com. And so that's great too. You've had your TED Talk, and Bill Gates, who's been a supporter of Our World in Data through his foundation, is a fan, as am I. So it's been quite a moment for you. Although I think, I want to ask you, do you feel like you're at the beginning of something? Sometimes people get a book out there and it's like, okay, done. My message is out. I got it, my TED Talk. I don't know how many views. Do you feel like it's done, or do you feel this is just like step one down a long road?
No, I think it's still step one. I think what I kind of wanted to do with the book is to shift the narrative a bit on what I see as narrative and discussion around environmental change and environmental solutions.
Right.
So I think what I wanted to do with the book was, one, to acknowledge, as you said earlier, this kind of seesaw of human progress and environmental degradation, which in the past has almost been always at odds with one another, right? The environmental damage has basically come as a result of human progress. But trying to change that narrative a bit to provide a vision of how we move forward, achieving both of these things at the same time. And I actually really think, we are reaching the stage where these things are no longer incompatible. Like, I think you can improve human well-being while reducing environmental impact. So that was part of the notion of the book, was to shift this narrative a bit towards, less of, almost, I think almost environmental action is framed as like damage limitation. And it's just things will inevitably get worse. We just decide how bad it's going to get. And I want to shift that a bit towards saying, no, we actually can build a better future, 2050, 2060, 2070. But I think in order to do that, you need a little bit of an image of what that positive future might look like. So I think, I think that was my kind of first stake in the world, was trying to present this positive vision. But like, it's not done. The point is we need to actually make that vision a reality. And that's kind of what I'm trying to work on now.
Yeah. And in a minute, we'll get into some of the meat and mashed potatoes in the book. I did want to get in a little sketch about how you came to be who you are so far. And I think it's important, especially in the context of our education system, and how we can possibly foster the prospect of having many more Hannah Ritchies. So you were at the University of Edinburgh, as you lay out in the book, when you think you were 16 when you started there, which is pretty cool. And like many universities, it's, ferment of positivity, negativity, all kinds of things. So tell us a little bit about these moments that kind of brought you to this methodology and practice you have now. And there's key people like Rosling and other authors who caught your attention. Again, you mentioned some of these folks in your book.
Yeah, so I started at Edinburgh University, and I studied environmental sciences. So I did environmental geoscience, then climate change management, and then I did a PhD. I think Edinburgh, was a great place to study, but I would still say that by the end of my degree program, I was feeling pretty depressed about the state of the world. I think there was just studying environmental sciences. There's just an onslaught of very legitimate bad news all the time. And I think the other issue I had at the time is that I was really looking at the news religiously. And I think I had this notion that to be a responsible citizen, I had to be checking the news all the time. And especially in an environmental context, if I wasn't watching what the latest disaster was and kind of trying to take that on myself, I wasn't caring, or I didn't care about what was happening in the world. So I think there was this combined effect of always just looking at this negative stuff on environmentalism, but then also just seeing disaster after disaster on the news. And maybe we can talk about that, but the effect that has is that you just then get this onslaught of thinking that everything must be getting worse and worse and worse because that's all you're seeing. And I think the issue I had there is that I was only looking at environmental metrics, but I was just assuming all of the human metrics were also getting worse, right? So poverty, child mortality, hunger, even deaths from natural disasters just must be like their highest level ever and just going worse and worse and worse. Right. But then I discovered the work of Hans Rosling, who's on the screen now, and he didn't really focus on environmental metrics, but what he did do was bring the world's human progress to life through the use of data. So he would do these amazing talks where he'd show how the world has changed over the last few centuries through the use of data. And what he would always show is that all of the metrics that most of us assume to be getting worse have just been gotten dramatically better. And then, other stuff, I was so ignorant of this stuff. Like all of the questions that he asked, I would have obviously got wrong. But I think that was like a little bit of a wake-up call.
The quiz he used to do was really something.
Yeah, compared to the
so that really jarred you. And was that after you finished college or while you were still there?
I think it was between my bachelor's degree and master's degree. So it was definitely like by the end of my bachelor's degree, and then I was starting to move on to something else. And I think that started to give me a little bit of a shake of, oh, like maybe there's some of the stuff I've got wrong or I don't quite have a good understanding of. And I think it also just highlighted to me the power of data. The fact that you cannot understand the world through media headlines, and you actually need to step back and look at the data. And then I think over time, just to touch on the last few things there, I think the over time I then became familiar with the work of people like Mike Berners-Lee or David Mackay, which they very much focused on energy and climate change. But what I really liked about their work is that they based it entirely on data. So the carbon footprint. How do you understand the carbon footprint of different stuff? Don't just go on your gut, try to put numbers on it. And the same with David Mackay on energy. How do you understand, decarbonization plans or solutions? You need to start to put numbers on it and understand it. So I think that those two individuals also kind of sparked in me, I want to understand these problems through the use of data.
Yeah, boy, Berners-Lee is interesting. I only was poking around and realized he's the brother of Tim Berners-Lee, who invented the web as we know it. There's something about that family that's worth checking in on. For sure. So let's get into the book. You focus very much on these compartments or themes that the environment has been subdivided into historically. But you start out with an important, I think, definition of sustainability. Historically has two parts, and it's how do we supply and support and have a thriving generations now, equitably, fully across the landscape. And what do we do about the future, people in the future? So just talk briefly about your definition of sustainability and definition of success, essentially, which then the book kind of lays out.
Right. Yeah, I think the definition of sustainability I use in the book is very close to what people would frame as sustainable development,
right?
Which is that sustainability there has kind of two key goals, or as I frame it, two key halves. The second half is what we more familiarly think of as sustainability, which is basically having a low environmental impact to protect opportunities for future generations. And I also include other species on that as well. So that's really focused on how do we reduce our environmental impact. And then the first half of the equation is we also want to provide a good life for the people on Earth today, right? It's not enough to just say, we could just massively cut our environmental footprint and live really, really poor lives, but that's not what we want. We want to make sure that everyone has a high standard of living while doing that at the same time. Right. The key point I make there is that you haven't really achieved sustainability unless you've achieved both of these things at the same time. And the argument I make is that historically we've actually never achieved both at the same time. As I said earlier, there's kind of been this seesaw where environmental metrics might have been quite good or low, but often human well-being standards were very low. over the last few centuries, we've seen that tip the other way, where we've seen lots of progress on human development, but it's largely come at the cost of the environment. And the theme of the book is, how do we do both of these things at the same time? Because I actually think we can, or we are moving towards a world where it's possible that we can do both halves at the same time.
Right, and that does generate some of the tensions, including around issues like energy sufficiency for those who have hardly any energy access now, and also constraining greenhouse gases. And that's a position that Johan Rockström has made, but never really has been heard. He's made the point, even at the climate talks, that this equity issue is key. And it's a source of tension, and it just means that the rich world has to do more. But then people kind of put their hands over their ears for some reason. I think you'll probably be getting some of that if you already haven't. But it's certainly, to me, part of my definition, and we'll see what people think as they listen to this webcast later too. I put up a slide just to say you do make some decisions about what not to include. It's not about the full set of risks, some of which I've written about, everything from asteroid collisions to what's Putin going to do with his nuclear weapons, to COVID coming back, or the next pandemic. So how did you make your cut? Like, how do you kind of decide what not to? Because it could be a very big enterprise.
Sure. I mean, I'm very much just focused on environmental problems there. Like, of course, there's a really long list, like a bunch of health problems that aren't there, conflict, AI, nuclear. Yeah, I couldn't cover. Also, the focus is very much on environmental problems.
Yeah, and that the issue of you do have a section in the book, and you talk about this question of who's the we, and this is something I talk about and think about a lot. Although not, I think it started for me about 10 years ago that I started to realize I use the word we a lot in my talks. And it's really important to ask, like, who is that? How much of that is about the future? How much of it's about people who don't have a microphone? And so can you talk about that aspect of this too? It's another part of the two halves, is the half that is already privileged and the half that is silent because they're not born yet, or because they're in Ethiopia.
Right. Yeah, no, I struggle, like I struggle with a lot, and actually we had lots of backs and forwards with my editors on how to define this. I mean, and the subtitle is framed as the first generation, and we have even had debates of, like, what's a generation, because there's multiple generations alive right now, and it's not the case that only one generation has to put in effort and the others don't. So I tried to broaden the concept of generation as just like people that are alive today,
that's
which
good.
is not quite correct. But yeah, I think the we is an important question. One, one is the inequality issue today, and by we, we have to take action is not the same for me versus someone in a really low income country that has CO2 emissions of almost zero, and the emphasis on we is me. But I wanted to. The reason I tried to use this more collective we, which does have issues obviously, is that what I also hope to do a little bit with the book and my work more broadly is to try to not create lots of really hard divisions, which I see all the time. And I see this, it's young versus old, it's rich versus poor, it's left versus right, it's deniers versus doers. Like there's so many, artificial lines being drawn where it's a kind of us versus them concept. And I think this is really damaging for us trying to build solutions. So I use we as a try to, like, more of a collective, I think this is a global problem that requires international cooperation, and it really involves most of us to get involved.
It does indeed. So when you think through the different areas, overfishing, plastics, forests, wood, and the rest, what are the themes that emerge? I think one, of course, is that data is valuable. And I think one of the things that gives me great optimism these days is the increasing potential, rapidly increasing potential to verify trends around the world using remote sensing or other means that weren't even conceivable 10 years ago. Global Fishing Watch is one I've written about, so not only, it's not just existing demographic data or data from the FAO on, exports of food, but it's this landscape of Greg Asner's work, Arizona State now using overflights with planes that can not just tell you how much forest is there, but how much carbon is in the canopy. So does that excite you to the idea that this isn't just some static review of data, but that we're creating a planet that's much more visible?
No, definitely. And I think one of the key issues we encounter our own data is either the lack of data or the poor quality of data that's there. So this is question of how do you build as accurate a view of the world as possible through data, knowing that some of it's incorrect or some of it's hidden or there's just no data there at all. And I actually
Right.
think over the next 10 years, we'll see actually really rapid developments in the quality of data that's there, the cost of attaining data. I think for many countries, it's just too expensive to invest in gathering data, even though it would be really useful. So I think this will just massively improve, and I think we'll just massively improve our understanding. I think what's also just an issue for data is also the frequency of updates. So often you're trying to understand the world today based on, the latest data, where the latest data is 2011. And actually
Right.
the speed by which you can get this almost real-time data on trends like deforestation or emissions or air pollution will just have a really profound impact on how we respond.
Right. Okay. And another theme that emerges in the book, chapter by chapter, is the importance of thinking systemically.
Mm.
It's not just acres of palm oil, acres of oil palms. Could you talk about? I have up on the screen plastics and palm oil, and they both have this. Again, your chapters have this important. You keep pushing the point, and I think it's essential that you don't just look at the thing; you have to look at the system. So, talk about systems thinking as it relates to your book.
Yeah, I mean, I think in many areas, but especially environmentalism, we like to have a villain, and we try to find a, this is the bad thing. This problem will be solved if we just get rid of that bad thing. And I think there are, examples of this like palm oil. And by the way, I was in this camp previously. If you'd asked me, what do we need to do to end deforestation? It's like, let's all boycott palm oil.
Yeah.
Um, and the key point there is not that palm oil hasn't had a really profound impact on the environment, right? It has led to significant amounts of deforestation in Indonesia and especially in Malaysia, where most of the world's palm oil is produced. So it's not that it isn't a problem, but if you're trying to find a solution to that problem, just the catch-all, we should just boycott palm oil and move to something else, doesn't take into account, where that other vegetable oil is going to come from. The positive and maybe also the downfall of palm oil is it's a really productive crop. Like per hectare, compared to other vegetable oil crops, you can get like 5 to 10 times as much oil.
Yeah,
Now,
you
what
have
that
amazing.
means,
The
yeah,
book has an amazing graph showing that distinction.
yeah. So it's super productive. And what that means is that if you were to try to produce this same amount of vegetable oil from another crop, basically what that means is that you would need to use a lot more land. And depending on the crop you use, you might just actually increase deforestation, but displace it elsewhere. So I think when you try to think about these problems, I think it's important to factor in not just, what's the direct impact, but what would the counterfactual be, or what would the system's impact be of switching from one case to another. So when I looked into, what experts on this were saying about the palm oil problem, very few or actually none were really saying the solution here is boycotts. What they were saying is we just need much stricter standards on how to produce palm oil sustainably. Like how
Right.
can you reap the benefits of the high yields without sacrificing the downsides of the environmental damage? And that's to me, that's what we should be working towards, not this kind of catch-all, let's just stop using palm oil.
And that all relates to quality of data, verification.
Yeah.
Supply chain integrity is a key, right? Because you want to know if that
Yeah,
end
yeah.
product is coming from A or B is a very important question, right?
Yeah, so the RSPO, the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, is a kind of certification scheme, but that's based on having data and be able to track whether these standards are being met and maintained over time. I think again, some case for optimism there is I think a number of countries now are trying to set up much more transparent methods for calculating the deforestation that comes from imported food. So I've seen France do this. I think maybe the UK also does this. There's this program called Trace Earth, which tries to basically map the imports of different products and link that back to potential deforestation that's happening. So I think all of this development and monitoring and reporting of data will only increase the transparency and increase the pressure on different actors to fulfill the promises.
Absolutely. And talk about plastics a little bit too, because there's a big chapter on plastics, obviously.
Yeah, so the problem I focus on for plastics in the book is ocean plastics or plastics leaking into rivers and the ocean. I'm quite clear that I don't have the solution to the potential microplastic health problem, for which we actually just don't know what that problem is or what the scale is.
Yeah, that could. I've done other shows on that, and we'll do more. Yeah, I'm showing here. There's a company in Lombok in Indonesia that I interviewed the guy who runs this little company, Honest Ocean. They're trying to get at the source in Asia, in Indonesia, particularly in some rivers and waterways. This was a canal that was opened, an irrigation canal, that it just was a mind-boggling thing to see. Stuff that had accumulated in a lake over time was flowing through this. And I guess this too gets at the reality that it's waste we're talking about, right? Not so much plastic production, or there are lots of uses for plastic that are vital still. Maybe not in that canal.
Right. Yeah, I think the issue I have with some of the discussions around plastic is that we know that plastic pollution is a problem, but often the solution or the focus of the solutions is, how do we just use less plastic? Actually, that might not even tackle the problem. The problem there is really a lack of waste management infrastructure. If you are producing plastics and managing it at the end of the chain, putting it in a sealed landfill or recycling center or incineration, it's not leaking into the rivers and not leaking into the ocean. And I think too much of the focus has just been on how do we just stop using plastics, and less focus has been on how do we just invest and improve waste management infrastructure at the end of the chain so that the stuff isn't leaking out into the environment.
Right. Well, again, I encourage people to get the book and look through it and discover these solution paths. Your latest blog entry was about understanding of nuclear energy, and the energy. There's a whole section on energy in the book, and this gets us toward a bit of a transition toward the beliefs. The word about beliefs, and I put up this slide sometimes when I'm speaking about these issues because it's got Bill McKibben and Jim Hansen, both of whom I've been on the same trajectory with, all these decades. And they have fundamentally different beliefs about nuclear energy. They're both committed to the climate fight. Jim Hansen, the famous climate scientist, he once called the idea of rapid expansion of renewable energy, if you believe in that, you believe in the tooth fairy. This is Jim Hansen. And of course, when Fukushima hit Japan, Bill McKibben wrote a column saying it shows nuclear power is too brittle. He's kind of migrated a little bit toward some nuclear, yes. But this gets at all the information you're presenting to the world through your blog and that I do, as a journalist, communicator, gets into this arena where our beliefs sort us out, as you were saying earlier, as either yes people or no people, or on whatever the thing is. And it's not even just climate denial. Here we have nuclear denial of one. If you believe in one of them, you don't believe in the other. So how are you finding your path here in this world where, even as your survey that you document here in your blog shows, most people don't understand the emissions of nuclear energy. So what's your, how do you stay sane, as I said in some tweet earlier, as you're trying to push forward into this kind of arena?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to lie that sometimes it can be frustrating. I mean, the fact that, surveys suggest that, less than half of people in the UK know that nuclear is a low carbon source of energy. I mean, there are various other, points that you can argue on nuclear around cost or construction time, but the fact that it's low carbon is really not on the list of stuff we need to be debating. But I actually think, while I get frustrated a little bit at times, I think I still have some sense of optimism that most people don't hold their views as strongly as we might imagine. I think we imagine most of the population just have really strong beliefs about everything, including everything within the climate and energy space, and they just won't budge. And I actually just don't believe that to be true. I think there are particular tribes where there's no data I could show them, no discussion I could have with them that will shift their position, and that's fine. But I actually think they're probably a minority. I think for the large bulk of the population, they don't have time to study what's the deal with nuclear energy, or what's the mineral demand for electric vehicles. They're potentially interested in the issue. They have questions about it, and I actually think it's our job to put out good information and disseminate it widely so that people can get a better grounding on these issues. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do, is to put out just really clear information. What does the data research tell us on this? And I think there's often this narrative that facts or data don't do anything to change anyone's mind, and I just don't think that's true. I think, again, for some people, they're so staunch in their beliefs that that is true. But I think for most people, they're just curious and they're just open, and they're actually deserve us to have like a good conversation where we can communicate this clearly.
Yeah, I think that's true too. Unfortunately, in the social media space, the ones who are locked in on these hard edge positions tend to be the dominant voices, and this goes back before social media. I used to, in my print journalism days, the people who write letters are people who are highly motivated and have a position, and the people who are just I would tell journalism students, don't forget the silent reader. Don't forget the people who are, as you were saying, absorbing the information. Don't get too stuck on these pissing matches, and because there's lots of other people out there who might not be posting pithy comments on Instagram. So I think you're onto something important here, obviously. I wanted to get at this notion, and I think you've had to push back in some interviews you've had or in some press coverage to say this is not a book about climate change, and meaning not just about climate change. It's about the full span of sustainable progress. And Mike Hume, who's over in England at Cambridge, down not too far from you guys at Oxford, has a book out that I had him on the show last year, and he's a longtime climate researcher, IPCC author, and he's concerned that we're getting to there's such a hyper focus on emissions, on carbon, that it's distracting from the wider picture of vulnerability reduction, of all the other problems in the world. And if we get, and he calls it climatism. And as I said earlier, Johan Rockström, this is a slide from his presentation at Glasgow a couple of years ago. It's kind of hard to read, but he basically points out there that the vast majority of people on the planet haven't used enough energy to make emissions reductions a top priority for them. They need more energy. And he actually calculated, he asserted that it's up to the rich world to make deeper cuts in their emissions to justify this unavoidable temporary surge of emissions in developing countries. So I just wanted to ask you about that. Do you think people are how would you characterize people who are sort of in the visible space around sustainability? Or is there too much of a focus on carbon?
Yeah, a bit. And I think it goes actually broader than that. I mean, if you look at what we cover on our own data, I primarily cover the environmental stuff. And of course, I think climate change is a massive problem. That's why I spent like so much of my time on it. But, on our own data, you have 5 million children dying every year from causes that are mostly preventable. You've got 500,000 dying from malaria. You've got some dying from diarrheal diseases. Just to name a few, like small, well, in some sense, small problems among a much bigger, longer list. So I think when you step back to look at the full spectrum of massive problems that the world faces, you cannot possibly come to the conclusion that climate change is the only problem that we face.
Right.
I think that's really key for how it's like key for how you frame priorities, right? Like if you're investing in one area, in some sense, you're possibly taking away from another area. So it's how you balance this really broad spectrum of problems and try to get priorities right there. I mean, I completely agree with Rockstrom there that this is, for most people in the world, carbon emissions is just not a problem because they emit very little, and the focus is very much on the richest
Right.
group of the world to drive this. There was actually an interesting Substack that I read the other day from Todd Moss, who is
Oh yeah.
he leads the Energy for Growth Hub, and the kind of point he was making there is that you have this weird effect where we're all clapping and cheering some of the poorest countries in the world for celebrating carbon reductions or near-term carbon reduction targets. And his key point there was like they're hardly emitting any carbon whatsoever. And if they were to list their priorities in terms of development and environmental problems going forward, like carbon is so on the list. It's almost negligible. And I think this kind of gets to the heart of it. We only tend to view things through this very, climatism lens of it's all about carbon molecules, and other problems get pushed to the side. I mean, one of the points I make in the book, I go into lots of detail in the climate chapter on how we reduce emissions, what we need to do, how we get off of fossil fuels. But like a final point I make at the end is like one of the key, adaptations or ways to deal with climate change is literally lifting people out of poverty and making them less vulnerable. And in so many interviews, the interviewer has really been really confused or raised their eyebrows about how on earth poverty alleviation is any solution to climate change. But it's such a vital part of the vulnerability, hazard, risk equation. And I think we don't put enough emphasis on that.
We don't indeed. I've written so many pieces on that formula, the exposure and vulnerability parts of the risk formula, that I can't count them. And they don't tend to get read because they're not about carbon or they get resisted. And there are scientists, Roger Pielke Jr. has infamously been punished, and he can be very prickly, and but he's made some very important points about this. The trends that we see in disasters are more about exposure and vulnerability, both in rich and poor places, like Florida, a classic example of hurricanes. And that gets to this third issue I was hoping to raise with you, which is about the behavioral sciences and the social sciences as they relate to these problems and solutions. Your book is very much about, listing the concrete or plastic, the physical, manifestations of the problem. And at the same time, there's this fundamental need to understand the social science, both in terms of who will absorb data and act on it, and just understanding why there are differences sometimes. Have you dug in on that much?
On behavioral sciences?
Yeah, as they relate to how people perceive or ignore information,
right. Not a ton. I mean, no, I haven't. This is not really my area of expertise. I think a really clear thing that tends to come through for me, which I might be wrong on, but my overall sense is that behavior change is very hard, and trying to figure out how to change behavior is very, very hard. Which is why I think many of the solutions I end up leaning on in the book really come from this: how do you create alternatives to what people already have that are more environmentally sustainable, and crucially are lower in cost? And I think that part of that stems from maybe my pessimism that behavior change is very difficult. I mean, if you think, for example, if you look in transport, for example, I advocate for walking and cycling and public transport, of course, but I'm pessimistic that everyone does that, and therefore we need an alternative to a petrol or diesel car. And the key there is, how do you make an electric car environmentally sustainable and also cheaper than petrol or diesel. Like the same on, I mean, people have told me that beef gets a really hard deal in the book, and it does. I'm pessimistic that, just me showing people the carbon footprint of beef means, they switch their diet to tofu and beans. Some people might do that. The majority of the population will not. And therefore we need alternatives to meat, which is like meat, has the texture of meat, tastes like meat, but just doesn't have the animal. So I think part of my pessimism about behavioral change probably pushes me more towards what people would frame as technological solutions, but importantly, low cost and economical technological solutions.
Yeah, Jesse Ausubel at Rockefeller University back in 1999 wrote an essay. I think the title of the essay was "The Human Brain Will Not Change, Therefore Technology Must." And he drew me into that arena pretty early on, and I'm with you on that. And that's why I've focused on innovation, R&D, the role of innovation in agriculture and energy, of course. But I think there also is a role for understanding the behavioral end of things better, if only to get more comfortable with the differences and the dynamics we were sort of buffeted with. And I wanted to show something here that relates to that. And maybe it's sort of a next book or next project. I don't know, at Our World in Data, how focused are they in working with social scientists to find ways not just to convey the data, but to convene or to have a dynamic around it that gets past the finger pointing. This is the finger pointing to me. I've used this slide before. And these are two dynamics. It's Exxon's fault, or just, oh my God, we're doomed. And and there you are in the middle. Many of us have been in that boat, and that's a famous 19th century cartoon about a politician going through the famous rocks in one of the Greek myths. So the science is such that this challenged me as a journalist, and I don't know if it challenges you as a data scientist and communicator. Dan Kahane is a behavioral scientist at Yale who, starting in 2009, I began paying attention to his work. And by 2012, 13, he was doing these studies, empirical work that showed, this headline just really hammered me, climate science literacy unrelated to public acceptance of human-caused global warming. And what he found was that basic science literacy is highest at the two ends of the spectrum. People who are avidly rejecting the science and people who are avidly worried about it. And that led me into this whole writing a lot about this. And it sounds very doomist, in its own way, because it's sort of like, oh my God, we're doomed. Information doesn't matter. But it led me to understand something that you just hinted at, which is that most people, if you back away from the us and them dynamic and just have a conversation about energy or a conversation about food, you can find all kinds of ways for people who are very divergent culturally to agree on basic principles. I don't know. I just think it would be great to get that into the discussion. I'd be happy to host a future show with you and or with others at Our World in Data, like Lisa Schipper, who's one of the great, much published scientists on disasters and climate, very focused on loss and damage and everything. And a year or two ago on Twitter, she posted something really interesting to me. And this relates to the work of Our World in Data and what might be some gaps to think about filling somehow. There's a whole body of social science where they actually talk about what they call qualitative data. And to me, as a journalist, I had this show. You're seeing kind of a still image from the show. We were, Seth Bornstein, an AP reporter, and I were like, what is qualitative data? How do we report on that? That's not data that I understand. But there's a whole bunch of sciences that have this. It's when social scientists do hundreds of surveys or interview 100 people in a field or in a situation, and it doesn't come down to neat graphs and stuff. But it's really important in terms of like assessing vulnerability. There's no good data for vulnerability. I'm sure you could talk about that too. So how do we fill those gaps? Is there a way to think about whether, I don't mean the next webcast, but is this an issue that you think about in terms of the adoption, the sort of transition dynamics?
Yeah, I mean, I think like I also wouldn't really have known what qualitative data
Yeah, I know. It was a
was.
very jarring word to hear.
Yeah. I mean, I mean, the way our own data, I mean, I think the quantitative data, if we're going to make a differentiation, like tends to be like at the heart of a question of starting, or at least the key starting point of a question. Like, how do you use even if it's about opinions, for example, what do the surveys show us quantitatively about the range of opinions there? But I think there is also scope for saying, okay, like to some extent, a little bit what I did in the recent nuclear article, where
Right.
I started with the broad survey data on just do people think it's low carbon or not, and then you can start to delve into why they think that. Why would they think that it emits carbon? Which I don't know, maybe I'm misframing the qualitative data, but that maybe is like a follow-up of why they believe the given thing, as opposed to another, which you can't really necessarily quantify that or put that on a graph, but it's important part of the story of how you then interpret that data. And in some sense, and the example of the nuclear low carbon, you need to understand why people think it's high carbon in order to start to address their concerns around that or try to explain it in a clearer way. So maybe that's how you start to bring these two together. Or maybe how I would do that would be to start with the quantitative data and then rely then on the more qualitative data of delving into why people have a given belief.
Yeah, the qualitative data come into the actual science more in the context of vulnerability assessments, for example, or impacts after a disaster, where you'd have to do longitudinal tests of, if a woman was dislocated or if her kids didn't get to go to school for a year. It's really hard to find a number
Right.
for the impact on those children's capacity to grow up to be sustainability scientists,
Right.
instead of having no job and dying young. So that's this arena that I think, the more dialogue there can be between or among the disciplines working from these different vantage points, the better off will be. And it does really help to. And by the way, journalism falls into the same trap, because we say, well, wait, I can't report on that. That's like soft. That's soft science. So it's an interesting point. Then the other science that I find encouraging, or at least it helps us understand the divergent reactions to a book or a study, is Thomas Elmqvist and others, starting in 2003, 20 years ago, in Stockholm, did this big multi-author study of what they call response diversity as a property you would want in ecosystems, that it's a metric for resilience. Basically, the more responses that a particular species in an ecosystem has to a stress, whether it's drought or whatever, the more likely it is to be resilient to change. And they recently did work taking this forward into the social sphere. There was a paper that came out last year that basically says the societal diversity of responses to a problem, whether it's climate impacts or like, is actually good. It's adaptive. It means, in a complicated planet facing a multidimensional problem, you don't want us all to be Bill Gates, and you don't want us all to be Greta Thunberg. You don't want us all to be Andy Revkin or Hannah or the other people in this picture. So that's encouraging. And I think that's where your book comes in really handy, because hopefully people with all those divergent perspectives will find it as a resource, and also our world in data. Just also, the last thing I want to ask you about.
I mean, just on
Well,
that,
yeah, talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, just on that, like I think even when I was trying to think about blurbs for the book, I was actually really keen to get people where if you put them in a room, they'd have a ton of stuff that they would disagree on. And actually they come from very, very different places. Like Bill Gates is an optimist, like you probably frame himself as a techno optimist.
Right.
But he's next to people like David Wallace Wells, who wrote, Uninhabitable Earth, like one of the, the
Right.
scariest book on climate change ever. So I actually quite deliberately wanted to try to get like a little bit of diversity of people that, you know, even if I'm sure there was, everyone on that list had something in the book that they disagreed with, but if we can start to build, you know, discussions around that data, then I'd be really happy. And I think that response diversity or viewpoint diversity was what I was actually trying to achieve with it.
Right. And again, creating a baseline. Here's a baseline of information that you, whatever your position is, can start to have conversations about that can lead to new solutions. So what do you mean when you talk about urgent optimism?
Yeah, so when I think many people would frame me as an optimist. I probably frame myself now as an optimist, but I think the risk that holds is that, you know, when people hear the word optimism, they assume you mean, I just think the world will obviously just get better in the future, and it's a very thin line between that and complacency of just, yeah, things will be fine. I'm sure these problems will be solved. We can just sit back and relax. And that's like obviously really not my position. I think my position with urgent optimism is not this complacent optimism, but the notion that I think the world can be better. I think there is a pathway to a more sustainable world, a world with better human progress, better human well-being, and I think we have many of the solutions that we need to do that. It's about trying to turn that into reality, which is a very active form of optimism rather than this passive form of optimism that says, "Yeah, relax, everything will be fine."
Yeah, no, I want to wedge in a couple of questions. Can you go a tiny bit past the hour, or if not, don't worry about it.
No, I can. Yeah.
Okay, and thank you for your time again. Someone named Dorf on YouTube asks, this is about data quality, I guess. How confident can we be in somewhat optimistic projections of energy emissions like the ones from the IEA, the International Energy Agency? Emissions rose by 1.1% in 23. I read stories about India, Indonesia building coal, etc. So when you were doing your data assessments, how do you test them?
I mean, I think this is a big part of this is that at our own data, we most rely on historical data.
Mhm.
There's actually very few areas where we publish projections. I think we do it for population, for example. So we'll publish the UN's latest population projections, but we actually just don't have emissions projections or energy projections because inevitably nearly all of them will be wrong. Most predictions will be wrong. And the
Right.
fact that most agencies change them every single year will tell you that they're wrong because they've updated them since last year. I mean,
Right.
I think what this is getting at is that there are I know a range of projections that, you know, global emissions might peak in the next few years, and it's not just the IEA. There's a couple of kind of major agencies saying this.
Right.
I don't know whether that will be correct or not. I mean, I think he points out India or Indonesia there. I think that's true. I think India's coal use will go up. Indonesia's coal use will go up. I think the big question mark, which will really just massively tilt global emissions one way or the other, is China. What China does in the next few years will, for me, ultimately determine what happens to global emissions. And with China, there are a couple of conflicting stories there. One is building clean energy extremely quickly, is really trying to assert dominance in clean energy, not just solar and wind, although it's building them really fast, but also in electric vehicles.
Right.
It's really trying to establish dominance there. So it's very much seeing clean energy as an economic opportunity, which is positive. But there's the other side of that it's still building coal plants. So there's that juxtaposition there. I also did a post a week or so ago of, I think when people see that China's building lots of coal plants, they automatically assume that China will obviously be burning lots and lots more coal. Now, that might be correct, but those two things don't necessarily have to go together. It is actually possible that China builds more coal, but those power stations run less and less often as clean energy comes on the grid. Again, this is speculation. I don't know what China will do, and I don't know what global emissions will do. Yeah.
Right. And there's a couple of that watcher and Doug Grant had questions about tipping points. There's a section in the book on this. So, and there's a lot of news lately about tipping points. And you did write about the 1.5 or 2 degree threshold as being misperceived quite often as being like a hard line in the sand. How do you deal with the tipping point question, which is still in that murky arena of things that you can't assess necessarily by looking back at data?
No, you can't. And the key point about tipping points is it's very unknown. I mean, there's known unknowns and there's probably unknown unknowns that we
Right.
don't quite know about there. So it's complex. I mean, I think there are. I mean, I'm basing this on the latest literature on what scientists, including Roxcrom that we discussed earlier, are saying about these potential tipping points. I mean, there are a couple that we think are possibly in the 1.5 to 2 degrees range. I think it's important to try to get a balance there of acknowledging the seriousness of these tipping points without falling into this notion that we get flung into this runaway warming scenario, which is not what scientists project by tipping points. So there's stuff like Arctic sea ice. I think by 2050, the Arctic Sea will be in the summer will be free of Arctic sea ice, which will have an albedo impact. Now, the quantification of that is that we think globally that might increase temperatures by 0.1, 0.15 degrees Celsius. There's the Amazon tipping point of tipping more into a savanna-like state than a rainforest state. So there are a range of these tipping points that we think could be in the 1.5 to 2 degrees range, and they make our job much, much harder. Again, the permafrost feedback, you get carbon release from the permafrost, it makes our job much, much harder. But there's a differentiation between that and, it's too late, we're flung into this runaway state and there's nothing we can do about it.
Right, and this gets back to the systemic analysis you mentioned earlier, the section on deforestation, and a lot of my writing over the years. I wrote a book about the Amazon in 1990. Is about fragmentation and road building and what that produces. And if you have a less fragmented forest, it can tolerate a lot more change and other factors too. So that's the key thing, looking at those multiple dimensions. And I'm glad again that the book does that. I think we should call it, because you're in supper time mode, I think, over there. And I'd happily have you back to talk about other issues. Population is raised in the book. I've done a couple of sessions on that. I've written a huge amount. And you did mention the 10 billion figure. I don't think we're going to get to 10 billion in 2060.
I want to clarify on the population. When I mention it, I'm in the camp that population is not the problem. I just want to clarify that. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no. The book kind of makes that point too. But I just saw the 2060 10 billion. I think that's probably old news. It'd be less than 10 billion. And I also don't think depopulation is a problem either. But that's for another day. This has been great, and I'm really glad. One last feature of what you're doing at our World in Data is the teaching hub. My wife is a longtime science teacher, and then she spent the last 6 years of her working life teaching teachers how to teach sustainability. How to incorporate things into existing lesson plans so kids can kind of get their head around these concepts. And I think the more they look at your work, and I'm hoping the book somehow, is there any effort yet to get it into curricula, or will that come down the line?
Yeah, not yet. I mean, I've had feedback from teachers saying that, they have started to incorporate, aspects of the book into their work or assigned it for reading. And actually, our World in Data more broadly, like we have the teaching hub there. I'd say it's a under-nurtured area of our work. But I think we also just know that teachers are bringing the work on our own data into their own teaching and probably doing a much better job than we are at developing resources, because they're much more creative on teaching aspects than we are.
And even better would be if kids just find it and have their own capacity to translate this data into clever things on media platforms that you and I don't even understand yet.
Right.
So this is great. Thanks again, Hannah Ritchie, for being on Sustain What. And I really would love to have you back, perhaps with someone like Lisa Schipper, to talk about how we can integrate softer data that really matter for sustainability into some of these projections too. But the book is a must read, obviously, not the end of the world. And I hope people follow your sustainability by numbers.org Substack. Thanks again. This will be archived and available for anyone to share after the fact, and people can look at that distracting scrolling bar at the bottom to get in touch with me with questions or further show ideas. This is Andy Revkin up in Wabanaki territory in Maine, signing off for the day with Hannah Ritchie and in the UK. And thank you again for coming on, and good luck with this.
Oh, thanks so much. Big fan of your work. Thank you.
Great.